You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast.
You're listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. My name is Shawn Ivan, and along with my awesome co-hosts, we interview the innovators in the space every week. We've got an exciting episode for you listeners this week. Ivan, go ahead and get us started.
Hey, I'm Ivan Zach. Very excited to introduce today's guest, a colleague of mine, Dr. Clayton MacKay. We're going to talk not only about innovation in veterinary medicine, but the evolution of innovation, because Clayton was enough in veterinary medicine that he was probably here when the penicillin was invented. He started at 1950, as he told me, with his dad being a veterinarian as well at that time. And in his bio, the highlights are he has a career as a veterinarian for 22 years in companion animal practice. He was an owner of multi-doctor generalist specialty practice, 4 years in academic administration of a veterinary teaching hospital, and 13 years in the industry. 52 years of involvement in organized veterinary medicine. Past president of Ontario Veterinary Association, Society of Veterinarians of Ontario. Both organizations have new names now. Toronto Academy of Veterinary Medicine, American Animal Hospital Association, Society of Veterinary Medical Ethics, and Ontario Veterinary College Alumni Association. He's a life member of Canadian Veterinary Medical Association, Ontario, AHA, AVMA, Toronto Academy of Veterinary Medicine, and Vet Partners. Clayton, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
So you probably seen it all. Tell us, how did you start in veterinary medicine? What is that story of 1950 that you started with before the conversation here?
Well, it was that early. When you have a father who graduated when I was 6, I actually went to a kindergarten on the same bus he went to vet school on. I crossed the road actually to go to kindergarten. I'm not sure how safe that was, but it was kitty corner from the vet school. So when I was done with my part of a day in kindergarten, I crossed the road and sat in an anatomy lab.
Ooh, that's a good one to sit in for a child.
1950 with all those animals with no skins on them. So my poor aunt fainted when she came to pick me up one day because she'd never seen a horse with no skin.
So that really reminds me. So I went to vet school first time in Ukraine because
Yeah.
I'm an immigrant. And so a girlfriend of mine at that time, she went to vet school without. We have to go right after high school. So some
Right.
people are very young, and then they take 5 years of school. So her dad told her that there's no dead animals in the anatomy class. So she fully believed that it was just a cadaver, but made out of like plaster or something. And she was eating sandwich one day in the anatomy class when she realized that it's a formalin-soaked dead body of a cat, where she fainted, and it probably was similar to your aunt. So, okay, well, was that at Guelph University where your dad attended?
Yes, it was. He went to OVC from 46 till 50. It was directly out of, well, he came out of the service, actually. He came out of the Royal Canadian Air Force. I was actually born in Calgary, Alberta, while he was in the service. And then I really apologize for not knowing why and how he suddenly got interested in veterinary medicine. My grandfather was a Great Lakes captain on the iron ore boats, and my dad was about to become a first mate on an iron ore boat when the war broke out and he enlisted. So I'm assuming it had something to do with his Air Force career, and then came back here, of course, and went directly. Well, first of all, he had to go back to, I think they called it rehab school, right, and finish his high school, and then get into university. And that school was 4 years. In my case, I actually applied for the last year of the 5-year program, which was very similar to yours, which is actually the old British system, and unlike the American system. And I found out years later, my best man at my wedding here in Guelph was actually an associate registrar who later became the registrar, who about 10 or 12 years later told me the story that I had been accepted into the 5-year program, but there was an unwritten rule in all the calendars that they only took 10% women. And in 1964, there was a graduation of more than or less than 10% women, so they dropped the last 5 guys, and I happened to be one of them. So I got to move to the 6-year program, which turned out to be the greatest thing that ever happened to me, because my school, or my year, when they opened year 70 OVC, there was only 32 or 33 of us Canadians. As usual, the university had forgotten to tell people they changed the rule. And so there was only 32 of us. So the majority of my classmates were American, and 5 from the Caribbean, and 1 from Africa, 1 from Japan, 1 from Malaysia, Dr. Singh. It was a fascinating group that I've gotten to know over the years. And now that unfortunately we're winnowing down in numbers, I still have classmates all over the world.
Wow, that's fascinating. So I want to go back to the topic of percentage of women. So they were required to accept 10%, or they needed to go over that, or no more than 10?
That was it. It was most professional programs, as I understood the times, that they didn't allow more than 10% women into any professional program.
They're
Wow.
majorly failing on those numbers today because if, as far as I'm aware,
Hey, be
there is
careful.
about
Be careful,
85%
Ivan.
of women. No, I'm just saying that if that's the rule, they're not following it, which I'm
No,
excited about, how
no,
women are
no.
dominating our profession because they're better scholars than men, from what I understand. Actually, do you have an opinion on that? That's because that's what I heard. But do you
Yes,
know
I do.
why women are more dominant than men in our profession today?
Well, as I found out when I came back to the university 22 years after graduation to become head of the teaching hospital, I was somewhat opinionated as to why there was so many women. And there was the opinion in the profession at the time that the schools were choosing women ahead of men. And in fact, that's how they applied. So shortly into the late 70s, it began to change slowly. And then, as all professions did, really, there was a big impact as women went to university, period. And now there's more women in universities of all type than men. And the other professions kind of slowed down around 55% women, and veterinary medicine just skyrocketed through the roof. And that's as I understand it from my friends in academia, that about 86% of the undergraduate classes are women. That's how they apply.
Hmm. And because what I heard, and I know that this is a careful topic for 3 white men talking about this on the podcast.
Certainly is.
I'm genuinely curious because what I heard is that, again, being a foreigner, just in terms of why the profession is more women today, is because the way I see it in Ukraine, we men or guys had to go to university. Otherwise, you're going to be drawn into military. And we actually, not only one reason because you wanted to go to university, but you didn't want to go to military, and that was one ways out, that you actually go to university. So most of my high school class, I think it's 2 people that didn't go to university. But here, because it's a free choice whether you want to study further or not, I heard that women are much better at studying. They're more sort of diligent and they're better scholars. And then men want to explore a little bit more after their high school. They could work some temporary jobs more than women, and that's why, because veterinary medicine is such a hard profession to gain, in terms of the amount of education you have to get, that women are just better at studying, and that's why it's actually more female profession today. Is there any sort of proof in that? Do you ever heard anything about that?
Well, I mean, I've heard all kinds of things. I've sat in more hours of why does our profession look like it does than anybody I know in the past 50 years. And I think as I've postulated at some type in my own mind, that actually while women are in dark rooms studying to get into vet school, men are out looking for women. That changes the game.
Yeah, well, because it's like Simon Sinek said, there's finite and infinite games. So I think
Yeah,
that getting into vet school became the finite, and men are still chasing women where they are.
that's
So I'm
right.
going to shut up. We're going to walk into all kinds of trouble with this. Tell us what evolved in the profession except this separation between the different genders getting into school. What else evolved radically, as you can see, in maybe the general population perception of medicine? So I'll compare again my sort of newcomer perspective. When I got into vet school in Ukraine, it was really not that popular. All my friends were medical doctors, lawyers, dentists. And when I said I was going to vet school, they were like, "Huh, are you going to stick your hand up the cow's butt?" And I was like, "Yeah." So they were,
Mm-hmm.
it was not as prestigious, if you will. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that in North America, my understanding was when I came here, I was like, "Oh my God, this, I'm going to be called a doctor." And was that a thing all the time that veterinarians were doctors? Because in the UK, they're just starting that.
Mm-hmm.
They're not called doctors there. So what else evolved over the years that you've seen in the profession?
Well, I think that's an important change that took place. The uptick of veterinarians wasn't great prior to the Second World War, and most veterinary classes were quite small. And as we've already discussed, prior to the internal combustion engine, this was an equine profession. It basically lived and died by the horse, and in fact may have been the greatest time to be a veterinarian in the world for many reasons. Everything was delivered by horse. Everybody moved by horse, and in fact, to make that point even more upfront, all the armies moved by horses. And so if you had a bad veterinarian, you probably lost the war. And that's when probably the biggest importance of veterinarians was during that equine period. Then they went through, which my dad did primarily. I think he only saw a cat castration at vet school. There was no small animal clinic in 1950. It didn't exist until 1955. And so a big change in the species in which we looked after. And when you consider my dad's career, the early part of it at least was large animal based. He was in artificial insemination, head of a unit in Maple, north of Toronto. And breeding cattle in those days was a big deal. And that's where there was more veterinarians employed probably than anything else, or doing farm work. And it really was a change when the value of the animal meant whether you called a veterinarian or not. So if your cow was worth $50, you didn't call a veterinarian to drive out all those distances as time went on. On the other hand, when we moved from the large animal species to the small animal species, suddenly that animal living in your home was, to quote a credit card company, became priceless. And I believe it falls right back into much of the work that you've done on burnout, and where the great stress is for veterinarians is today in the companion animal business. You find, as your work did and many others, I gave lectures in this particular area early on after my dad committed suicide, 10 years after I bought him out. And that lecture, as I ended it in Calgary in 2011 or 12, I purposely kept that back to make a point at the end of the lecture that this was very personal to me, this subject and what was happening to veterinarians and what appeared to. And I worked during that time. I had no idea of the mental stress and what was going on within the profession until I really talked to David Barches in England. And David was one of the ones who'd attempted suicide and then went back to academia to study stress and burnout. And if you look back, the early papers were written by him.
It's so fascinating, Clayton. The evolution of veterinary medicine and the stress that's come along with these furry friends being in our homes, it goes hand in hand. It really, really does. One of the things that I wanted to kind of pick up on, just because of your sea of knowledge in this field, is what do you think some of the most innovative progressions in this profession have been? Where has technology really elevated the veterinary medicine game, in your opinion, and why?
That's a really difficult question to answer, given where you sat in the profession. I got very interested, I think the second year out of vet school. My wife and I took our first holiday and went to Las Vegas and went to an American Animal Hospital Association meeting in 1972. And from that meeting, I decided I wanted to change the way we practiced. At that moment, my dad was an innovator in many ways. He built a hospital for small animals in 1957. He entered private practice in 56. He actually built a practice, a separate building from our house in 1957. It sat behind our home. It was only 850 square feet. But that was really unusual. I didn't find that out for probably 30 or 35 years. I just assumed veterinarians had a separate building where they practiced. When I remember now, there was only 3 practices in the area, 2 in Oshawa, 1 in Whitby, all east of Toronto. And the other 2 practices, the veterinarian lived in a home that was part of their business. not a separate building. And so that was one change. And so by 1974, I decided, I was so impressed with the American Animal Hospital Association that I bugged my dad as we got busier and busier that either he was going to build a new hospital or I was going somewhere else. And so in 1974, we went from 850 square feet to 3,300 square feet with terrazzo floors, and Eaton's Canada did the waiting area. Big changes, mind you. In 1974, an AAHA regulation, you weren't allowed to show any kind of consumer product.
Wow.
You couldn't put a can of dog food. You could put it behind glass, I think, like one can. That would be about it. But you couldn't advertise. And by 88, when I took over my dad's home and turned it into the consumer part, the outpatient part of the practice. So I went another 3,000 square feet to go with the 3,300 I already had. I had 700 square foot of retail. I sold a lot of dog food.
So that's an interesting side of the business as well, that the veterinary business evolved right now from being sort of exclusively professional services on the large and farm animals, then transitioning into the retail. There's a small animal component, and then retail, which is a lot of pharmaceuticals, the over-the-counter stuff, leashes, collars, and things like that, and the food now with Chewy and Amazon taking that away. Where do you think that's going? Because there's some people are really nervous about. Well, they're very loud about it too, about Chewy. Some are saying, well, let's just focus on what Chewy cannot do, the professional services. So where's your position on this? Seeing it both ways, before, after, and now again.
I think now again you're looking at doing what you do well, and it's quite interesting to see the pet food market, which I spent 13 years in, working for Colgate-Palmolive, and most people don't even understand who makes pet food in the first place. That the biggest pet food companies in the world are first the Mars family. So the Mars family not only makes more pet food in this world than anyone else, they also hire more veterinarians than anybody else in the world. They have consolidated the industry globally, not just in North America, but around the world. And the next most common pet food in the world is made by Nestle Purina. Nestle was a very strong wet food producer, and they bought the largest dry food producer, Purina, in the United States. Those two companies account for approximately 60 to 65% of everything sold in the globe. Hill's Pet Nutrition, on the other hand, which is owned by Colgate and has been owned by Colgate since 1977, I believe, is a very tiny company. It is worth about $2 billion. And that's a small company by the standards of the big folks. They only sell food to veterinarians and to the private retail, and even then, only some private retail, not all of them.
So now you've been consulting practices for the last 12 years and all your wisdom collected across. What is your is there a methodology that you follow? Is there a particular area of practice that you consult with? Who can call you and say, I need your help?
Well, just about anybody can call me if they wish to. I do not advertise. I'm now 77 years of age. I have no desire to work 24/7. I only want to work when I want to work. COVID has been somewhat kind to me because I've cut way back in what I do. It's so difficult to get out and do things today in person. I've never wanted to be part of a consolidator, particularly. That hasn't interested me. I've worked with consolidators and purchasing some of the practices that I represented, but not a great deal. I prefer doing whatever my clients have interest in, if they can find me. But I'm not making that an easy job necessarily. I'm on internet and I have a website that's probably 15 years old now, but it's just there. I'm interested in my profession. I'm interested in listening to your podcast all the time. I find them fascinating.
Thank you.
And I'm interested in where it's going. I'm still involved with the College of Veterinarians here in Ontario, which is our licensing body. I sit on a couple of different committees with them. but I don't agree with them all the time. I'm there because I enjoy it.
That's excellent. So, what would be your suggestion? And I know we're hitting the time mark every time, it's so fast. But what would be your suggestion to now, today, graduating veterinarians, given all that happens with our profession and the business where it's going? What would be your suggestion number one to graduating veterinarian to hit the profession, enjoy it like you have, and not burn out?
I think that they need to enjoy what they enjoy. The profession is very different. I have two sons, neither of which went into veterinary medicine, but I have 5 grandchildren, and I cheer every day that one of them will decide to be a veterinarian. I think there are so many things that are available to veterinarians today. I would advise them never to get stuck on a plan. I never had a plan. I ended up in practice and grew. My dad's one doctor, one employee, and my mother doing evenings and Saturdays to 6 doctors and 30 employees over 22 years. I then left that because I began to find that the harder I worked and the more people I got, I was going to have to buy other practices to feed the model I'd built. And that didn't interest me, going out to borrow 10 or $12 million. And I luckily invited the dean of the veterinary school at the time to my latest opening. And he phoned me one day and said, "Have you ever thought about being a teaching hospital director?" And I said, "No, but I'm interested in everything."
That's awesome.
And fortunately, I got headhunted into industry, a job I absolutely loved. I was in an airplane every day, but I enjoyed it.
That's awesome. Well, very inspiring. And, I am a big proponent of finding new things to do within the profession. I don't think that, today 40% of veterinarians are thinking of quitting because of, bad work-life balance and other things. But I think that there's different things that you can do. And definitely it was my fortune to do software, build a lab, doing podcasts, whatever you want to do, you can certainly do it within the profession with everything that you learned about. But we end every episode with the same sort of two questions. And one of them is about a book, a TED Talk, a YouTube video, or anything that inspired you recently.
I'm just turning around so I can show the two books that I've just finished the Rose Code last night, which is a fiction book, but has to do with the Second World War. And then this is The Spy and the Traitor, which was a book about a true Russian spy, Oleg Gordievsky, who turned out to be not only a KGB colonel, but a traitor for the British in N15. And so I enjoy both sides of the book aisle.
That's
Very
awesome.
interesting.
And Clayton, so the last question is another innovator, someone you think we should have on the podcast to have a conversation with.
I have a whole list of people that I made here, but I'll blow it down to one for you. And I think that the most interesting innovator at the moment is somebody, hopefully, whom Ivan knows, and that would be Jeff Wichtel, who's the current dean at OVC. An absolutely fascinating guy who graduated in New Zealand, came to Iowa and got board certified in Iowa, then ended up in UPEI. And even me being there for 21 years, we were never, as far as we can tell, we're ever in the same room. For whatever reason, I have no idea. And then once he's been here, he's now just been elected again. He's 6 years here at OVC, and he has a fascinating view of the world of veterinary medicine.
Thank you so much for listening to the Veterinary Innovation Podcast. By the way, Shawn and I are going to Fetch San Diego next week. Feel free to drop by Talkatoo booth number 540 if you want a demo or to chat with us. I'll be a homeless guy hanging out at his booth. If some of our listeners didn't get a ticket yet, you still have a chance to get them at fetchdvm360.com. If you want to hear about our new episodes, please follow us on any social media channel. Also, you can check out our website at veterinarynnovationpodcast.com. See you next week.